Okay, in this chapter, we're going to be talking about the V-Ray Adaptive DMC, which is V-Ray's image sampler. And essentially, what that is going to be the main way that V-Ray is calculating your image. And we're going to be talking about ways to optimize this, general techniques of how to get really nice results just right out of the box. And as far as V-Ray 3 is concerned, they have actually changed the default values so that they're a little bit nicer and a little easier to deal with. So it's really quickly our scene. You can see what I've done is I've created, this is some little tests from that main file. We've got a little dirt fractal going on. We've got our glass sphere right here, metal sphere, and then just a plain sphere. I've also got some fur. So if we turn that on, this is just V-Ray fur. And that V-Ray fur, if we take a look right here, we can see that the V-Ray fur is just kind of acting as some kind of grass blade sticking up out of that dirt. What we're creating here is a kind of nice situation where we need to sample, some rather complex things going on. So we've got our soft reflections, soft shadows, and then we have some really fine detail that needs to be anti-aliased. It's kind of a nice way to segment into our first piece of this. And that's really that V-Ray, let's pull up our render settings here. So we're on our V-Ray tab. Let's set this back to 8. So our default settings out of the box from V-Ray are going to be minimum subdivs 1, max subdiv 8, and threshold 0.1. These three attributes are going to be your main three that you're going to be using to control the overall quality in your image. The way V-Ray is working under the hood is there's always going to be a primary ray, which is the ray that's fired from the camera and hits an object. That main primary ray, once it leaves the camera and intersects something, is going to be the main driving force of the anti-aliasing. The anti-aliasing is driven through these three values, and it's really kind of separate from things like reflection sampling and shadow sampling. Things like the soft reflections, where we need to add extra samples into them to get them cleaner, we can call those secondary rays. So if we look at these three values here, you can see that we do have our minimum, which is going to be exactly what it sounds like. It's the minimum number of samples that primary ray is going to be doing. And then we have our maximum. And these numbers, honestly, right off what's really happening, the reason they're called subdivs is that this value is actually a square root. So you can square this number to figure out exactly how many physical samples are actually happening in the scene, but that doesn't really need to concern us too much. But what we want to do to start out is really try and pick, and our hypothetical situation here is that we have our full scene set up and we need to really dial in our entire image so that it's perfect quality. So we need to pick first a max subdiv value that works with our threshold, so that we can have nice quality anti-aliasing. So these three values do work together. The minimum is going to be the minimum, number of samples when it first fires. So if it hits a very plain surface like this background wall right here, it may only need to sample one time before it hits this threshold. Now the threshold is in this 0.01 is actually a color value technically. And what it's doing is when we, let's zoom way in here, when this threshold is 0.01, if we hit this pixel right here, and V-Ray will randomly go to the pixel next door and it'll, throw a sample. And if it finds that there's something different there, that's when it needs to go in and continually sample this area and really figure out the anti-aliasing. And that's where this threshold comes in. So it's going to be trying to reach this threshold before it achieves the max subdiv value. So if it achieves the max subdiv value first before it reaches the threshold, then it's going to technically, not be fully anti-aliased, and you may end up with a little bit of grain in that area, depending how far off it really was. So if we look at our little render that we've got here. Let's do one quick render. Okay, so here's our render. And just so we're all aware, depending when you're watching this chapter, we do have some render elements created in this scene. So if we look, we've got our GI render element, our lighting render element, reflection, refraction, and sample rate. This sample rate pass is really going to be our main information-only pass, where we can really have a kind of color guide to what's going on. So let's take a look at it. So it looks like that. And this is still the 1.8.01. Let's also go ahead and turn on our timestamp. So this took 32 seconds. I'm probably going to edit it out of the video. So let's analyze this a little bit further. What we can see, all of these blue values, especially this really dark blue, this dark blue is essentially one sample. All of the range through there, all the way up to this guy right here, are the areas where it is able to achieve the threshold. And the color represents how many samples were taken there. So the red means that it maxed out. It hit this maximum subdiv, and it was not able to really clean it up. If we look at our RGB, you can actually even really see that. There's quite a bit of grain in here. And what could be a little deceptive is these areas of really fine detail. So let's go ahead and save this image. Here's our render history. So even though in the sample rate pass, it does look like, these values of green are going to be pretty good. But in this area in the center where we've got some red, with such fine detail in there, we may need to start increasing our maximum subdiv to really get V-Ray to a point where it can figure this out. So let's go in and just set our max subdiv to 16, and we can see the difference here. So now if I go in and I look at my sample rate pass, you can see that I've completely gone full blue and green. Even over here, if I do one quick render of our reflection, there's still quite a bit of red in here, but in general, V-Ray does feel like it is achieving the threshold. Now, we can't take this sample rate pass totally as is, because I know if I even just look at the RGB here, I do still see quite a bit of noise in that reflection. The reflection's a secondary ray though, so that is a little bit different from the primary ray. V-Ray is trying to balance it out. So when it achieves that threshold, it's going to start taking away from the secondary rays because it feels like it did its job and it smooths that out. But I can look at this and visually see that there's not going to be enough samples there. Same with the shadow, because it's not completely linked to this guy here. But if we do a little wipe here from our other image, so let's save this one, and then we will set A. So our A is on this side. So this is our this is our new image on this side. And it's very, very subtle, but there's a slight shift in the pixels in that area right there. And so that may have reduced the sizzling in that area. If I look back at my sample rate pass, it's much cleaner now. Just as an example of what to look out for with really poor anti-aliasing, just even in the RGB pass, if I go in and render, let me turn off my A here, I'm setting my max subdiv down to 4. This, by the way, 4.01 are really good settings for going in and having a low quality render that you can do your look development tests with and lighting tests, just it renders really fast. But let's look at what that does to the anti-aliasing. So especially in this area of the fur, you can see that V-Ray is essentially stopping and not even completing the full line of the hair. And if I look at my sample rate pass, that also is very, very clear. You can see that this is completely red. So it ran out of those primary rays. It ran out of that max subdiv, and it didn't even finish what it was doing. it just assumed that this pixel right here, because it ran out, maybe this is a pretty good one right here, zooming way in. But, this is, even though we're zoomed way in, each frame of this, if this was a camera move, would be slightly different, and that's what causes that noise. You can really think of that noise as just a complete lack of V-Ray knowing what's going on in that area, and so it'll sizzle. So this pixel right here is fairly light in color, so it probably fired a ray, hit this one, hit some over here, and in general it hit more white pixels than fur pixels, which kind of makes sense because there's a lot of white around it. But what's happening is we've got a light area in the middle of our kind of dark hair, which probably shouldn't be there. Same thing's happening over here, and especially right in here. So that's where going in and adding additional anti-alias samples. So this, again, this max subdivs can be thought of as your, as a kind of a global controller for your total amount of anti-aliasing rays to cast. So if I set that back up to that value that I was happy with, we can maybe, 16 looked really clean. 8 was pretty clean. So let's try 10 and we can see what we get. And you can see now it's actually going in and really smoothing out those hairs. And that'll look much nicer. And again, if I look at my sample rate pass, you can see there is those little areas of red, but a little bit of red and yellow like that is okay. The best thing to do in this situation, if I was rendering a sequence of this fur, is to just, render 3 or 4 frames together and flip through them myself and make sure that it's not sizzling anymore. So cool. So we landed at 1 minimum and 10 maximum subdiv with our threshold at 0.01. Now we can go in and start figuring out a little bit more. Let's actually, we'll do one more full render since we need to go in and we'll do a full render at 1 and 10. Cool, so that's looking good. And now if we look in here, you can see there's a lot of noise in that reflection. And there's quite a bit of noise in that shadow. And again, a little bit to reiterate on this, but if I look at my sample rate pass, even though there's quite a bit of red in there, there's quite a bit of blue and green as well in these areas that I can really visually see that there's a fair amount of noise in that shadow. So what's happening is we're hitting our threshold and we're not really using all of our anti-alias samples. So this is very common, especially with soft shadows, soft reflections, that we have to go in and add additional secondary rays into our render. So the way this works is honestly, it's a little bit funny in V-Ray in my opinion, because everything is divided against our maximum subdiv. So let's start with our reflection. So I'm going to select this sphere right here and go over to my V-Ray material, which I didn't name, which is V-Ray material 3. And you can see in my reflection settings, we've got our reflection subdiv value right here, and it's set to 8. I like to think of my secondary attributes like this, like reflections and refraction, subsurface, and also shadows, more in terms of samples. So you have to do a little bit of math in your head, the way V-Ray is laid out by default. And you have to divide this number here, my reflection subdivs, by my maximum subdiv. And you can see that I get actually something less than 1 because 8 divided by 10 is some decimal. And so V-Ray will never let that number fall below the minimum, which is 1. So I'm essentially only getting one extra reflection sample. So I like to bump this value up in increments of my max subdiv. So if I've got my max subdiv at 10, and I want to start smoothing out this reflection, I can go in increments of 10. So right off the bat, if I just set this to 20, I'm just going to render a little render region here, so I can kind of see maybe just a little slice like that. And we can see what the difference looks like. So I guess it's a little smoother. You can see not that much of a change in the sample rate pass. That's okay. Let's try 60. So that's now 60 divided by 10. So I've got 6 additional reflection samples. You can see that did take quite a bit longer to go in and solve that reflection, but if I turn off my bounding box here, you can actually even see a pretty clear outline of that much cleaner reflection. And on top of it, that's now reflected in the sample rate pass as well. So if I go in and just do one quick render region here, and we'll go back to our RGB, we'll do one quick render. And you can see as that comes in that our reflection is looking much better now. So the gotcha and why I think this can get a little confusing in V-Ray is you do kind of have to keep track of when you're going in and changing this reflection subdiv value. Every once in a while, the max subdiv value that you do choose may need to get raised later down in the process. So, this feels really nice to me. I've got a little bit of noise up in here that I may still need to clean up depending on my test renders, but in general, that feels pretty good. The problem lies if I go in and need to say, just as an example, have my max subdiv set to 20, I've now reduced the number of actual reflection subdivs because 60 divided by 20 is only 3 instead of 6. So even though V-Ray has quite a bit more room to work with in the anti-aliasing, what can happen very commonly is this may get a little noisier and take a little longer to render, which is why it's important to pick a good max subdiv value for your scene. So if I do a quick test render again, you can see the last one took 15 seconds. I should have saved it. That's okay. So you can see I've gained a lot of that noise back down in here. It didn't necessarily take longer, but it did get noisier. So you do want to make sure you're keeping track of, if you can examine your shaders in Attribute Spreadsheet. If you go General Editors, Attribute Spreadsheet, it's open on my other monitor. Stand by. There we go. So if I hit select here in my attribute editor, hit that button right there, you can see all of my values. So, you could go in and find that value. So here's my reflection subdivs. And you could look at your whole layout of all of your materials and see which ones you've adjusted. But in general, this is really a very last step. It's really recommended to go in and keep these values at the default value of 8 until you're ready to go in and really start tuning them, because this number may continue to change throughout the process up until that final render. So let's change this back down to 10. So we're now back at 6 reflection samples rather than just the 3 from before. And now let's work on the shadow. So let's move this over a little bit. And you can see our shadow does have a little bit of noise in it. And if I go in, we've got our top light right up above here, just a V-Ray rectangular light. And you can see that we've got our subdivs on the light, just like we had on the material. So if we go in, we can start dialing this as well. I'm just going to guess at a value. We'll say 30. That's going to be 3 samples on the light. And you can see that that's much smoother. It looks great. It's probably good enough to just call done as is. So let's go in, and you can see over here, we're going to need to clear up that same shadow. So we'll render that one more time. So that's looking much better. You can also see that it cleared up a lot of noise on the sphere. So that noise on the sphere is coming from the light. Now, the reason I added these other render elements is so that we can look through them. And you can actually see, if I look at my lighting pass, that I'm seeing all of that noise in my direct light render element. What that means is that noise is coming from a light source. You can see if I look at my reflection pass, it's completely black over there. Refraction has nothing but that. More importantly, though, the stuff that's happening on the sphere is only lighting and GI. And if I look at my GI pass, it's perfectly clean. So that alone makes it really easy to start diagnosing your scene and figuring out where the noise is actually coming from. So if I go back to my RGB, you can see if I render that one more time, let's actually look at our lighting element while it's going. It got a little cleaner. I think I missed it. Went too fast. But you can see now, especially, that we've got a much cleaner result on my sphere. One of the things that the V-Ray documentation actually goes over is something called the universal settings. And I do recommend not using the V-Ray universal settings. I'm going to explain it because it is worth going over. If you're ever in a pinch and you just need something rendered that looks nice and you have time to wait for it, then it will work okay. But essentially what it ends up doing is we set our minimum subdiv at 1, our maximum subdiv we crank up to 100, and we leave our threshold as our main attribute that we can control the quality of our image. So we're giving V-Ray a huge amount of primary samples to deal with. So it can go in and figure out anything we need it to as far as anti-aliasing, but it'll take a lot longer to render. The big positive to the universal settings is that it's very easy. Because I'm at 1 in 100, it's going to be much more rare that I need to go in and actually start messing with shader and light samples. But you can really expect, on really complex scenes, it can be like 5-10 times slower than actually going in and optimizing your scene properly. So even though there's a lot of information on the internet about this, I definitely recommend not using it. So let's just do one quick test comparison. So I'm going to do one full render at 1 in 100. And even though I have some of these subdivs dialed in my scene, because they're all less than 100, they're essentially all getting reset back to one sample total. So it doesn't really matter that they're in there. So I can just hit render here. So I'm just going to unpause this so you can kind of see it going as it's rendering, especially in some of these areas. It's just really slowing down. Definitely pretty slow. If I look at my sample rate pass, though, very nice and blue. So V-Ray is achieving that threshold that I gave it of 0.01. And so this render will most likely be pretty smooth overall. So as that just kind of finishes up here, got a couple stuck buckets that didn't subdivide. Okay, so that's 44.4 seconds. I'm going to save that image. And now let's go ahead and take our max subdiv back down to 10. And you can actually see there's more noise in the shadow in 1 in 100 and more noise in the reflection than we even had in our other render. So let's do our new one at 1 in 10.01 again. But we now have our lighting subdivs dialed and we have our shader subdiv dialed as well. We'll hit render. So here's our new render. 41.8 seconds. So even though it's not a drastic speed increase, it is a little bit. And you can also see that our render quality is actually nicer in this version. We really cranked those reflection subdivs up, and the shadows are looking really nice and clean. So if I save this image and we do a little A to B, you can see the difference here. So that A, so all of that noise and that reflection and the noise in that shadow is all gone in our new render. And on top of it, it rendered faster. The one thing that may actually be, I would assume, looking nicer if we really zoomed in on it is going to be this fur. Because there's just so many more samples available on the 1/100 version for the anti-aliasing. But in general, you can definitely see the strength in this. So this is a very, not a very complex scene, but if we had a lot of shaders and we needed to dial all of them to get rid of that noise, that could start becoming very problematic for the universal settings, and your render times will start to spike very, very intensely. Going in and really dialing these shaders as you need to, rather than going in and just, as a whole, globally turning up everything, you can really change the way V-Ray thinks about this stuff. So cool. Now, something we do need to talk about are a little bit of methods. I do really feel, so just going back to these three main values in our adaptive DMC, something that's pretty, I just so you guys know, I do feel it's much more rare that I actually lower my threshold below 0.01. In general, that ends up with very high render times, but every once in a while, you may just you have a lot of leftover max subdiv values, and so you can start lowering your threshold to get cleaner quality images. But more importantly, right now, the next little step here of this process that hasn't really gone over yet is how to decide on your max subdiv value. So a really great technique is to go in and you can see I'm in my V-Ray tab here. And what we want to do is turn off first my GI and second my shadows. And then I want to turn off my reflection, refraction, and also glossy effects. And let's do a quick test render here. Not super exciting, but what's very interesting about this is now we're actually exposing our image in a more raw format. And if I look at my sample rate pass, you can see that I'm actually seeing the geometry borders in my scene. I already have this at 1 and 10, and for this scene, that's actually working pretty well. So at 1 and 10, let's lower this back down to 1 and 8, and you can just really quickly see the difference in our sample rate pass again. You can see this really just starts exposing the areas of where we have intersecting pieces of geometry. So you can see, we're kind of ignoring what's in the refraction. And if I look at my sample rate pass, I'm getting a pretty red line right in there, and I'm getting quite a bit of red, all of these areas where that fur, that V-Ray fur is intersecting the geometry. You can actually see that it's kind of doing that same thing where it feels like it's kind of phasing in and out a little bit. If you do have refraction, like I have a refracting sphere right here, you may still need to go back in. Let's go to that global options under advanced again. I'm going to quickly turn on reflection, refraction and see what that looks like one more time. Because I do see detail of the fur inside of the refraction. And so that is something I'm going to want to consider when I'm going in and sampling this. You can see it's actually handling it very well. Because this is a sharp refraction, as in my shader for my refraction. Let's take a peek at that really quick. You can see that my glossiness is set to 1. And so that's actually still going to be an anti-alias value rather than if I started dialing this soft, that now it becomes a secondary ray value. So it's a really nice way to just kind of simplify your scene. It'll render very quickly, and then you can go in and with this stuff off, with reflection, refraction off, glossy effects off, and also turning off your GI, you can go in and get a nice idea of what a good max subdiv for you is going to be. You can see if I set this to something like 20, I'm greatly reducing those areas of green and blue. What's actually very interesting is I do still have that area where it just cannot go in and figure that out. But even though I see some very bright red, when I look at my actual beauty, the RGB is totally fine. So it's definitely got more than enough to go in and sample that area. But it's just going to show a little red in the sample rate pass. Here's another one. You can see if I look at my sample rate pass now, I'm nice and clean. So definitely don't need 20. We'll bounce this back down to 10. And now we can verify that our 10 max subdiv is a good value. It also doesn't hurt once you're kind of landed at a good value, you can click back on your GI. It is going to affect a little bit what's going on in your scene. Just because, like if this edge is so bright right here and it's bouncing light up, that may be a different amount of, that may change the anti-aliasing a little bit, just like we needed to turn on the refraction over here. So a lot of this stuff, is a little fluid. And as you're going and, as you're using the DMC a lot, you'll start getting used to this kind of stuff so that you can make these decisions on the fly. Okay, so we're back to our original render here. And one of the new features of V-Ray 3, when we're speaking of optimization, is actually going to be in the Settings tab. There's this little checkbox for Use Embry. Once you've got your Use Embry checkbox turned on, you can see that it exposes these 4 more checkboxes down here. It was interesting though, when I turned it on, this Use Embry for Motion Blur was on, and the documentation actually says it's supposed to be off by default, but in this scene, it was on. All of these settings are worth just experimenting with. High precision is actually, it says in 3D Studio Max V-Ray, it says use Embry for hair. But high precision is actually used for scenes. You can turn it on if you have lots of really long, thin triangles in your scene. Conserve memory is going to take a little longer, but it will be a little bit more memory optimized. And then this use ray packets checkbox is a little bit newer, and honestly, all it says in the documentation is that it's experimental, and it may or may not increase your render time. So I would just save your scene file and do a quick render with it on and do a quick render with it off. But anyways, you can see my render took 41.4 seconds. And now with only my use Embry checkbox turned on, I'm just going to do one more quick render. So in this scene in particular, the first go at it didn't really do too much. It supposedly is going to be a 30% render increase. But obviously that doesn't work for everything. And this is a fairly simple scene, so we may not really feel it all that much. But in general, it's definitely worth trying out. I'm going to try turning on some of these other little checkboxes and see if I get anything that works a little bit better. So with my high precision mode turned on, it shaved off another second. We're down to 39 seconds. So I'm going to next try turning on the use ray packets checkbox. And we'll hit render. And just like it said in the documentation, that may increase your render time a little bit. Looks like it didn't really do that much for me. 39.6 seconds. So it didn't increase it, didn't decrease it. It could have been just even the way I was moving my mouse around for the interactive buckets on the render view that changed it. So if your processor supports it, which in general is all of the i5, i7, i3, probably a bunch of the Xeons as well, definitely try it out. See if you get any rendered speed increases. Every time I've turned it on, it seems to have shaved off a little bit. This was actually one of the least exciting, but saving 2 seconds on your frame of 40 seconds is not horrible. So could be worse. And that's it for the Intel Embry, one of the new features. The last new feature that I want to go over as part of the adaptive DMC, I don't really feel is ready. I mean, it's here. I think it's more studio friendly, but there's this divide shading subdivs checkbox. Now what this does is we do have, as we just had our whole chapter discussing going in and on our shaders, dividing the number of reflection subdivs, for example, against our max subdiv. By turning this checkbox off, it will actually make your reflection subdivs actually be thought of as samples. So it doesn't matter what you change this to, you're actually doing 60 additional samples on this shader past the regular one. 60 total secondary ray samples that you're forcing V-Ray to do on this object. This is a really wonderful feature, and it will make all of the idea of reflection subdivs instead of samples much easier to understand and explain. But right now, the way it's set up, all of the lights and materials in V-Ray all have a default value of 8. So you have to make sure that you have some sort of tool in place. And again, at a studio with a little bit of pipeline, it's not too hard to do, but you want to make sure that you have a really nice way of going in and just keeping an eye on all of your different attributes in your shader, because there are quite a bit. You can see we have reflection subdiv, refraction subdiv. If you're using subsurface scattering on a V-Ray material, that also has it. If you have a V-Ray subsurface material, the naming on that one's going to be slightly different as well. So there's a more than a few areas where you could inadvertently have a default value of 8 kind of add a lot of extra rendering. So even though this has been implemented, and I do like the idea of the feature, just so you know, when you're using it, or if you're using it, you do have to be aware of how many subdivs you're using in your scene. So it's kind of it will, I think, be an easier way to work. But until then, I still think it's easier to use the divide shading subdivs method and stick to our default value of 8 and do the math ourselves against the max subdiv. So again, something that's totally up to you, but just so you know that it is an option for you. The last thing I want to talk about in the little lecture here regarding the adaptive DMC is really not, I guess it's not really information, it's more of something not to do. There's a lot of information around on the internet that says to set your adaptive amount to 1. That is definitely a bad idea. The default value here of 0.85 actually works great, and I never really mess with this. There's actually an article you can look up. One of the lighting leads at Blur was talking about it, and what he found was that you actually start getting really unpredictable results when this is set to 1. So I'm not really sure what those other websites were talking about, but just so you know that there is that information out there and that it's bad advice. So keep that at 0.85. Honestly, I don't really like to mess with these too much anymore. I think that the default values that they've got work really well. And I really only focus on these 3 values up here, our min, max, and threshold. So as you continue using it and, playing around with the subdivs and going in and just really making a high quality render in a optimized time frame, and just keep practicing, you'll continue to get better. So that's the adaptive DMC, and now we're going to go on to the next chapter.